You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, PhD candidate at Northwestern University studying Russian literature and film.
And I'm Cameron Lalana, a literature enthusiast and a guy working in media.
This is the podcast for people who want to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture. Every episode, we're going to be bringing you the background and analysis you'll need to understand these works.
And if you're interested in supporting us, you can head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. All right, Matt, what are we getting into this week?
This week, we are going to be reading a short story called The Performance by Sergei Dovlatov. It is an excerpt chapter, kind of part of this book called The Zone that he wrote. It was published in 1982.
And so for Dovlatov, we're going to talk about him in a second. Matt and I, before we started recording, were debating how much people might know Dovlatov because our instinct was no, but as Matt pointed out, in 2014, it was in New York, you said, New York City, street was named after him.
Yeah, you got like one of those honorary street names.
Right. So we're still, the debate is ongoing on that. But Matt, do you mind if I ask you, for a lot of people, let's assume the case is not, who is Dovlatov? Who is this guy writing about the zone? Who's this guy writing about gulags?
Well, Cameron, I'll tell you one thing, he's a writer for sure. That's who he is.
Sure.
Yeah. I know. I'm having this mental debate too on whether people do know him, should know him, or what the deal is. But so he's considered kind of a late Soviet writer. That's the sort of period that we're working in, and this will be clear as we get to the content matter.
Right.
So he lived from 1941. He died in 1990. He was an emigre writer, more or less. Right. He lived in New York. That's where he died. But he was raised in the Soviet Union, worked in the Soviet Union before he emigrated. He was born to a kind of literary family, a theater director and a literary editor. He was raised in Leningrad. He studied philology. He got expelled from the university, as all good philologists inevitably do. Got drafted into the army, where he served as a guard in the northern labor camps. And that is what the subject matter of The Zone refers to.
Right.
And what it's all about. It's kind of about his experience being a guard for these camps. Which, interesting question to raise on that there.
Right.
Put a pin in that one for later.
Finally, an underserved perspective in Gulag literature, the guards. Which I say ironically to some degree, but also truly, I mean, it is interesting to get that perspective, especially from this era. But
yeah, it was a good story. It was an interesting perspective. But
yeah, do you mind if I'm going to point something out too about Dovlatov, which is that he came of age when he was a teenager, or young, I think a preteen actually, when Stalin died, and so Khrushchev comes to power, and I think importantly for people from this era, Khrushchev then gives this secret speech in which he condemns the crimes of Stalin and speaks to the Soviet Congress and saying, hey, this is what's happening. This is what happened during those between 1936 and 1939. This is what really happened. It's not the fault purely of Yezhov. It is Yezhov who oversaw the purges until he himself was purged in 1939 for wrecking himself for basically going too far. And then you have the Khrushchev thaw, which comes next, which is the kind of this promise of a new beginning. And so a lot of younger, more, I hesitate to use the word like liberal because I feel like that's putting too much of the American political context, but like liberal, not so much in like the American context, but in opposition to the idea of conservatism, like maintaining the current order. A lot of writers were, or not the writer of creators were freer briefly in that period, but of course after Khrushchev, his reign is relatively brief. He's followed. I don't remember if he's immediately followed by Brezhnev, but he's followed by Brezhnev, who is much more conservative, much more old guard, maintaining the ways. And so you go from this kind of I don't want to use say hopeful, but like this era where there's the idea that we're like, oh, we might be able to do more, to a period of relative stagnation. Brezhnev would have been in power through most of through most of Dovlatov's adult life. I think Brezhnev came to power in like 1962, and he reigns until he dies. He is at the head of the Soviet Union until he dies in 1982. Dovlatov comes to the U.S. in 1979. So for most of his adult life, after a brief period when he's a teenager under Khrushchev, he's living under the era of Brezhnev. And the era of Brezhnev, I think, should point out, is a relatively stable period, probably one of the most stable, uneventful periods, so to speak, relative to other eras in Soviet history. But it also, there's this old joke, and you may have, if you are in, Slavic studies, you've probably heard it. And Matt, you've probably heard this before. But I feel like this is for people who are maybe not familiar with this
I'll
era.
pretend I haven't.
Okay,
for the sake of
perfect.
the audience.
Perfect. Well, if you could give me a good laugh, that would be, practice that before, and that'd be good.
Okay.
So you've got the Soviet people on a train, and the train breaks down, so they turn to their leader, Joseph, Stalin. They say, Stalin, Comrade Stalin, what should we do to get this train running? And Stalin says, shoot the engineers and exile the train conductor to Siberia. And they do, and the train starts running again. It goes for a while until suddenly, again, it breaks down. And this time, the people turn to Khrushchev, and they say, Comrade Khrushchev, what should we do? And Khrushchev says, look, bring those the conductors back from Siberia. We'll put them back in. They know what they're doing. And they say, okay. So they do that, and things work for a little while. And the train goes on until it again breaks down. And finally, this time, the people turn to Brezhnev. They say, Comrade Brezhnev, what should we do to keep the train running? And Brezhnev looks around, and then he kind of grabs a blind and pulls it down and says, pull all the blinds down and we'll pretend we're moving. Which is, I think I got that from The Russians by Hedgewick Smith. But that's a joke. Yeah, that's roughly indicative of the era. But and in Dovlatov's own words, I'm pulling this from the article, Antiheroes in a Post-Heroic Age, by the author's name is not immediately visible to me. I should have written that down. It'll be in the show notes. But Dovlatov writes on this period, if under Stalin, talented writers were first published, then covered in filth in print, and finally shot or destroyed in the camps, now no one was shot, almost no one was put in prison, but no one was published. The best writers, making like conspirators, wrote, as they say, for the drawer, and those less honest, trustworthy, and truthful served the government, receiving in turn access to very tempting material goods. So we're kind of looking at a brief period of, maybe from Dovlatov's perspective, artistic freedom, or the possibility, I should say, of artistic freedom to an era where, like, you're not going to get sent to the prison camps for what you write, but, like, just no one's going to publish you. So you write for the drawer, not out of fear, but just out of knowing that that's not something that's going to be just not going to be regularly published. Right.
And he was published in the Soviet Union, but not to the degree that he would be after he leaves.
Right. So The Zone, this piece, the performance comes from his larger book, The Zone, and which is all about sort of this the experience of being a guard in the prison camp. So interesting in comparison to our other series on the camp system. The Zone being a nickname for the Gulag, and I'll link you in the show notes our episodes on from Zuleikha, which is obviously modern fiction, but also Varlam Shalamov's collection of short stories, which we covered much earlier, which covers what the prison camps were like in the 1930s. And reading that in relation to this is really a stark difference. But let's talk more about that in a second. If it works for you, let's talk about the performance itself.
Works great for me.
All right, perfect. So at the performance, we have this prison guard who is working in the camps, and he's called aside by his commanding officer and says, hey, look, we have a play we're going to put on. And, our guy's like, and they say, look, we need you to transport, we got this thief. He's a thief, but he, with the right work, could look like Lenin. So we need you to take him over to this other camp to start preparing this play. So I don't think this guard is ever named, but so he collects this guy, and after spending some time kind of in the camp and discussing what life is like, he takes them over to this other camp where the other prisoners and workers in this play are waiting. They discuss, they have a relatively open conversation. Even at one point, the guard lets this guy Gurin go off by himself to use the restroom, kind of being like, I don't know, is he going to escape? Maybe he will. And the Gurin eventually comes back after he considers maybe I shouldn't have let my prisoner go off alone into the woods. But where are you going to go? So they go over to this other camp and they meet up with the other actors, and it ends up being a group of a group of other prisoners, or zeks as they call them, one office worker. The concept of the play is that you've got two plots. The main plot is about Lenin and Felix Dzerzhinsky. If you're not familiar with who Felix Dzerzhinsky is, he was the sort of I think he ran the Chekists, but he was the kind of the head of the secret police, so what would eventually evolve into the KGB. And so you've got Felix, who's working himself to the bone, and Lenin saying, hey, I need you to take a break because it's your duty to the revolution not only to work, but to maintain your health. And the B plot is you've got this young Chekist, Timofey, whose girlfriend is leading him into like basically being a revanchist, being a white guard. And eventually Lenin convincing Dzerzhinsky to look into his health leads to Timofey being really inspired by that example, and eventually becoming him chastising his girlfriend, and the two of them becoming bright young examples of Soviet heroism. And so for most of the play, you've got these group of prisoners who are all there for various reasons. Thieves, I think one. I'm not exactly entirely clear on what perversion with a minor means, so I can't 100% say a pedophile, in this play, but very possibly. So this group of prisoners are training and going through all the, this half-art, and this, obviously none of them are trained performers. The camp leadership doesn't have a strong idea of plays either, very much. A lot of people who don't know what they're doing, leading other people who don't know what they're doing, which continues on until finally they put on the play, which goes more or less okay. As they're putting it on, you lead into this, and they've got all these interminable speeches ahead of it. The play itself goes mostly fine. The audience this is just heckling them most of the time before it ends on a singing of the Internationale, and some thoughts by our narrator. That's a relatively abridged version going in. But as we often say, devil is in the details in this. And there are a lot of fascinating details in this, this version of the camps from a prison guard's perspective. I would assume this is taking place in the 70s at some point. Is there anywhere you're interested in starting on, or anywhere you want to elaborate on?
I think I wanted to clarify the way that I interpreted the crime of perversion of a minor.
Sure.
I'm pretty sure is ideological perversion.
That's fair.
I think this would have been either a teacher or like a Komsomol group, like youth group leader, essentially. That was my guess, is that the people that are in these camps are kind of just like, these are like petty criminals. These aren't like serious crimes that usually they're in for.
Right. Yeah. And a great point to make, which is that the prison camps, when you usually think of Gulag literature, I think you're usually thinking of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, or maybe Shalamov's work, and you're probably thinking political prisoners, everyone who doesn't agree with the government being shipped off. That's not the case here. We're as Matt says, this is just literally entirely made up of petty criminals for the most part.
Right, and that's so my first point on this story is the time period in which it is written. As you hinted to, most people are familiar with early Gulag literature when that was like a revolutionary idea to write about. This is no longer a revolutionary thing to it's not shocking to the public that these camps existed. It's no longer the entire justification for writing. I think it's a deeper probe into what the psychology is sort of like of the broader system, not even the individuals. And so it takes this really shocking aspect that would have been or rather was shocking when Solzhenitsyn or Shalamov, when they were writing about this, and it transforms it into something that is completely and utterly banal. It is just the most everyday sort of description that you could envision being used to describe a forced labor camp. Right. So it's no longer this sort of scandalous thing. It's like an accepted fact of life. And that sort of sets the tone for the absurdity that ensues.
Yeah, I think you can see that in the reflection of how Dovlatov appraised the relationship between the prisoners and the guards, which is the guards are obviously literally ruling over the prisoners, but also they're wandering around. We got the prisoner at one point. Gudin, who plays Lenin, is complaining about how, hey, why am I'm just a bank robber? Why am I in a prison camp when, Lenin and Dzerzhinsky, those are the biggest no-termers of, bloodiest no-termers in our history. No-termers, I believe in this case, meaning like someone who's a lifer, someone spending a life in the camps. Those guys should really be in here, and the garden and other, in other earlier works that might be a major moment of, of horror, shock and horror. But in this case, the guy's just like, oh, please shut up. All right, can we go on? Like there's ideological crime is not a feature anymore. You can call Lenin the bloodiest criminal in your history. They don't give a shit. The guard might agree with you. Right.
He probably does.
Yeah. And also, at this point, Dovlatov, like you say, fact of life. And I think I don't know exactly how. I don't think there's a way to quantify this, but this is something that like the Soviet public knew about, and frankly was probably even fairly interested in, just as like an idea of the zone being like this place far away, where whatever happens, it takes on its own sort of life. I would suspect maybe in the same way that neo-noir interesting to draws people in.
The concept of the zone though is interesting in around this time, because it's something that is being explored more in art and literature. Like Tarkovsky's Stalker, if you're familiar with the film, the whole point is that there are these guides that take people to this zone, and there's a scholar that wrote, or I don't know if he's a scholar, but a critic that wrote a book exploring this called Zona, and it's about the kind of connotations of this area and the sort of psychological effect on people. It's not explicit that that's what this is in Tarkovsky's film, but it's just kind of like an interesting, I would say, like cultural aspect that is kind of just permanently there by this point. And so that's what is kind of an interesting change to be reading about something published in the 80s versus, I don't know, like 50s.
Yeah, right. In the 50s, you've got two. I mean, I think we already harped on this point, but reading Shalamov's work, you've got these, the prisoners who are enduring intense hardship, and many of them are heroic, many of them are not. But they're kind of living on this grand era. In this case, this is nothing grand about this era. I mean, I think one of the I don't know if this should be funny, but it kind of was funny. It was before the play. Actually, it happens. You've got all these guards, like this interminable number of speeches, and one of the funniest ones is one guard who talks about like, oh, here's all the socialist resolutions we need to take forward. It's kind of not really commanding tone. It's I think it's read that he's really not a very good speaker, but his socialist proclamations have nothing to do with socialism. His pro-socialist proclamations are, we need to get murders in the camp down by 26%. Right, you've got this era where sort of, I guess, like the grandiosity, for better or for worse, feeling like you're in an era of great import is not the case at all. I don't think anyone feels that that this is important in the slightest. They're just making it through the day.
No, definitely not. And I think that's a good segue into the play itself, or the performance itself, and the sort of conclusion, because I don't think it's about necessarily what is, it's about what wasn't. In the idea of just holding up this ideological veneer, in the 40s, right, when you're fighting the Nazis, you get a little rah rah, go Soviet Union, like you can have some patriotism going on around that, but by this time it just seems so pointless in comparison to what is actually happening in the country. It's no longer really addressing any of the concerns of most of the people, right? That's kind of where the sort of absurdity falls on this. Okay, I think now is a good time for a break. We'll be back in just a second.
And this episode is brought to you by you, our listeners. You can support independent podcasting by heading to our website, slaviclitpod.com. You'll get the access to the notes we used to make this episode, including links to all secondary sources mentioned.
If you want to support the show but don't want to spend any of that hard-earned buried treasure that you dug up, you can join our email list for free at slaviclitpod.com, or you can leave us a nice review wherever you get your podcasts.
Questions, comments, want to appear on our Office Hours podcast? Drop us a line. You can reach our voicemail at 209-800-3944. One more time, that's 209-800-3944. Or you can also email us a voice recording or text question at slaviclitpod@gmail.com. We'll also bring your question. We'll do your We'll do our best to bring your question on the podcast and address it.
All right, let's get back to the performance.
Intermission over. Back into the prisoners, back to your seats. In another, speaking of your absurdity, like in another speech, the camp commander who opens up to play, he's like trying to give an inspirational speech, but then again, he meanders into just moderate things of like, oh, by the way, stop having sex with goats before he gets cut off, or at least the narrator cuts him off when he can't even, there's no grandiosity can't even last 5 minutes before you get back into the banal of the prisoners keep having sex with goats. Stop. But yeah, to your point, there's a quotation from the author Sherbakova, who from the same piece that I mentioned earlier, which I think kind of gets to the point of what you're saying, where she says, this is, I believe, before Stalin's death, where she says, like everyone else, I lived under the impression of the victory, capital V victory. It caused a kind of memory block. I forgot, even though I knew perfectly well, that my grandfathers were murdered during collectivization and my uncles were killed in the bloody year of 1937. I became a patriot to the very bones, and everything in me squealed with joy at my wonderful homeland. Generally, when I read about people from this era, there's a sense of import. Again, not to harp on it too much, but we're here now.
Right. And I think the culmination of the play is probably the funniest point, if you didn't kind of get it by that point. But it's sort of that's sort of the reason that this kind of works for me as a short story. I can't remember who said this or where I read this, but the kind of effect of a short story is right at the end. The kind of culmination feels as if it was both sort of expected and there the whole time, but also kind of surprising and a lot of times witty, right? And so this sort of piece works for me as a short story, partially because of this very ending scene of Lenin looking out over the crowd of petty criminals, in this prison camp who are in the back smoking, and they've started playing cards during the play, which presumably nobody can hear because there's no microphones, and there's hundreds of people stuffed into this room. And he looks out and he says, "Who is this? Who are these happy young faces? Whose are these cheerful sparkling eyes? Can this really be the youth of the 70s?" And I think that last part, can this really be the youth of the 70s? I mean, it's so biting. It was so funny when I got to that part.
Right. Yeah, that's really sticking out too. I think it's interesting to get to that point, because it really, over the course of you stick with the play, not beat for beat, but for a good portion of it, scene to scene. And at this point with these characters, you are the narrator starts interchangeably using the person's actual name with the character they're playing. So Gurin, who plays Lenin, interchangeably he's Lenin and Gurin going forth, kind of like forcing this imposition. I think there's a more technical term for that, of forcing imposition. I'm trying to remember it, but you've this forced imposition of memory and reality of the actual Lenin, who might have actually gone through the what the play is suggesting, who might have actually been doing these things, versus the reality of the bank robber Gurin playing him. But by the end point, by the time that you get to the this line, can this really be the children of the revolution, you've really it's slipped back into entirely out of that memory in an interesting moment, which immediately follows that. I will say it's not an entirely it's a detached piece. It's a very ambivalent piece, but it's not an unfeeling piece. It's not entirely acerbic, right? Like, this is, what is our country? I think it's worthwhile noting that at this point, the prisoners are heckling, our good friend Vladimir Ilyich, and then someone like one of the prison guards yells like, "Just end the play." Gurin's like, "Seriously? There's like 2 lines left," and they're like, "Just start singing the Internationale," and they do. And interestingly, the crowd suddenly transforms as they sing this Internationale, which we've got "Arise, you wretched of the earth, for justice thunders condemnation, a better world's in birth. 'Tis the final conflict. Let's stand each in his place. No more chains of violence shall bind us. Arise, you slaves, no more enthralled. The earth shall rise on new foundations," which does bring them in. Maybe less so on a specifically Soviet calling than in the general terms of what the song, the lyrics themselves call for from a group of prisoners. And the narrator says, Or the narrator notes, suddenly my throat contracted painfully. For the first time, I was part of my unique, unprecedented country. I was entirely made of cruelty, hunger, memory, malice. Because of my tears, I couldn't see for a moment. I don't think anyone noticed, which is pretty close to where the story actually ends. So I think it's interesting to read this as it's very critical, very acerbic, very like this is my country, but also this is my country, better for worse, with all its cruelties and all its being stuck in memory. This is who we are, and I think that the phrasing "unprecedented" is fascinating because it shows like it's a kernel of the kind of earlier eras of excitement, but one that's extremely tempered by the intervening years.
Right. Yeah, I think it's almost like an acknowledgement of the end. This whole, can this really be the youth of the 70s? Because if you don't have youth, you don't have a country, basically. And if you've imprisoned all of your youth, what is to be done? Another great question.
What is to be done? And I think too, also saying, no one noticed the narrator's tears. It's in so much of our literature, especially early Soviet, there's so much focus on moving away from this individual, moving towards this consciousness that we are a Soviet, we are a Soviet Volk. We are a people who live and die on that notion of the people. But this piece, Dovlatov's writing is so fundamentally individualistic that even, the most important moment of this play is a private moment. No one even notices it's happening. Mm-hmm. No one notices this this narrator's existence. And up to this point, I think it's interesting that this is something we haven't covered too much. I don't know if there's too much to say about it, but we really, on each of these performers, we went over that pretty quickly, but you really go in on each of them, what each of them are like, their habits, how other prisoners feel about them. One of the prisoners is a gay man, and that's something that's commented on that's forces him out of most social circles, and he kind of goes into what that means for him as a gay man to be in the camps. Or, this woman, an office worker who has this habit of acting like a prisoner. It's said, I think, although it's not just her, but we really follow her, so we get the most of it through her. But the narrator at one point mentions that generally administration office workers started resembling Zeks, meaning prisoners, after about a month. Even contracted engineers fell into using camp argot, not to speak of the soldiers. Right, and so getting into each of these characteristics, it's focusing on such a micro level on each character, but also each character is not part of a larger whole, except for that one moment that they are singing the Internationale and they come together as this unprecedented country. But the moment it's over, he's crying and he's alone and no one even notices.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that a lot of the way that the work is actually structured kind of has to do with what you're saying on this individuality, kind of this aspect of, right, the individual versus the whole. And the way that it's narrated is really quite interesting. So I read this article by Igor Sevelzon, and it is called, what is it called? It's called The Third Way, Sergei Dovlatov, and it is about how essentially Dovlatov structures a lot of his works. And Dovlatov, this is not like an exception, this work. A lot of his work is satirical. It is absurd. If you extend this to the late Soviet period as well, you'll see this kind of across the board. There is a lot of vulgar absurdity that kind of arises in the 70s and continues. I'm thinking Mamleev, Sorokin. There are some really messed up things that get written around this time. And so it's interesting to think about absurdity. And I think that this one here shows just such a fundamental fracture on how people perceive the world that they're in. So Sevelzon, this is translation just loosely because it was in Russian, so you're welcome. He says that the main conflict in Dovlatov's artistic world is the conflict between rough and dirty reality and its brilliant but false Soviet ideological image. The conflict splits the world into equal parts that are in opposition, but not in struggle with one another. It does not imply development. It does not imply victory of one over the other. And he continues on to say that the world is split into two half norms, which are each presented to themselves as the norm. And right, that to me is what is interesting about Dovlatov, because it is not the early Soviet ideological victory. We're going to win out against the other. It is a sort of coexistence of others that only the reader is able to see and read them as in conflict with each other. But the individuals in the story only see their own, right? They only see what they see as the reality. And so the absurdity comes as to the reader, essentially, where you're able to see that. And, the narrator as well can see this, right? Because they're telling the story, even though it's not all, right? Some of it is left to the reader. It's not just the narrator, right? So like that line, again, not to keep hammering in on it, but I liked it so much. Can this really be the youth of the 70s? Right? If you are the ideologues, you're seeing the sparkling bright future. But if you're one of the petty thieves in the prison camp, right, it takes on this biting, ironic sort of image, and you as the reader can see both and see the absurdity of that statement. And I think that to me here is the difference between absurdity and insanity, right? Like, I don't know, this is just my kind of idea that insanity really, it's not rooted in anything real, whereas the absurd is. And it comes from this conflict of, brilliant but false and dirty and real. And so that's kind of like how the structure to me played out in this. And I thought it was really interesting, and I really liked the article. So if you speak Russian, you can read it. And if you don't, you can learn Russian and then read it.
Easy. No problem.
It'd take you a couple hours probably.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a fascinating. I'm still processing that point. I think that's fascinating in terms of forgive me ahead of time for my extremely vulgar meaning simplistic explanation of Hegel. And I've just sent some shivers of fear into Matt by saying I'm going to start talking about Hegel.
Please don't. Here he goes.
But so this idea of this third way of these two coexisting but not interacting realities is sort of like a tacit, maybe not intentional rejection of like the Soviet system as a whole. The Soviet system obviously based on Marxist-Leninist ideology, and Marxist-Leninist ideology obviously having its basis in Marxist ideology. And one of the most important features of Marxist ideology is a belief of history as a force that can move forward. Now, that might sound ridiculous, but of course history is moving forward. However, I mean that specifically in the sense that history can have a sense of progression, that we can raise class consciousness, that we're moving forward. We are probably all, this is something that's really a basic understanding that a lot of people are kind of brought up into, but it's not necessarily the case that, how forces interact with the world are actually going to force it forward. I think you could say that these forces interact much more randomly, that it's not that simple. But Marxism, one of its core ideas of how it views history comes from, and I apologize again for this extremely vulgar explanation of Hegel's dialectic, but you have, the forces of history move forward by your thesis and your antithesis, creating a synthesis, meaning a thesis, one force of history interacting with the antithesis or antithesis, a reactionary force, and those two things producing the synthesis by which history moves forward. But an underlying understanding of that is that what we move forward is in some way a reaction to these features, whereas we have, this so many decades onward, instead of a view of history which is so fundamental to Marxist readings of history, that history can move forward. This understanding fundamentally puts the brakes on the possibility of historical development, because these forces are not interacting; they are simply coexisting, and they are just languishing together, really.
Yeah, I think that it's something that kind of comes out of the stagnation period, which is roughly when this is kind of being conceptualized and, thought about. Just like you said, a stable time for the Soviet Union, but not a necessarily productive time.
Mm-hmm.
They're getting lapped by other countries and, just basic necessities, consumer goods, things like this. And so while it might be politically stable, it's just not, right? You don't have that sense of we're moving forward, which you did previously. You don't have a huge rebuilding. You're not like electrifying your country. You don't have those sort of things that are really clear and easy to point to.
Yeah, I think for an example outside of literature, I talk about this book a little too much, but it's really a fascinating read. Whatever you think of the author, and I do think some bad things about the author. The Russians by Hedgewick Smith, this American journalist who goes to the Soviet Union just to interview people, say, hey, what's going on? What's your life like? And people's concerns in this era, in the late 70s, are, like you say, very much about like, I wish I could just get, I wish I had my ability. I've got money, I've got housing, my life is stable. I buy what I can, but there's, oftentimes there's not that much to buy. Or like, what is my day-to-day problem? Well, childcare. These old childcare, personally for me, it's not enough. But also for like a lot of women, that the expectation of being a full-time homemaker, but also having a full-time job, right? You've got this push to get women educated, to get women into work, which is great. However, there's no cultural component, which is like, hey, men, maybe you should also do some housework, or maybe you should take care of your kids. That is still fully an expectation, which primarily falls on women. And so they express this, this anxiety of the fact that there's an expectation for them to go and get a career, which they, is like, that's fine. But just like, I wish there was more help, considering that culture, that I also am expected to do all these other things. Now, Hedgewick Smith goes off on a really weird tangent of like, this is why the Soviets need to be like, put women in the home. Part of the reason why I don't think that highly of his thoughts on it, but like that's the day-to-day concerns of people here. Not, as you say, Matt, not electrifying the country, not these grand projects, not building class consciousness, not fighting the revanchists, but like, I would like some more childcare, please, to go along with my full-time job.
Yeah, the ideological component is almost completely lacking by this point, and I think that's what makes the performance, the play, so kind of silly, and just like not the points when the political instructor, when he gets up to tell everybody about the play that's what they're going to be doing, and he ends by saying, "Are there any questions?" And somebody says, "A ton of questions. Want to hear? Where's all the cleaning soap gone to? Why are the warm leg wrapping? Where are the warm leg wrappings that were promised? Why is this the third month no films have been shown? Are they or are they not going to give work gloves to the branch cutters? Want more? When is the outhouse going to be put up in the logging sector?" And so you have this clash of the great ideological play, but without really being able to address any basic concerns, even addressing things like cleanliness, for instance. That's like a real base level concern, right?
Yeah.
I mean, films, hey, sure, what are you going to do? But, soap?
So, right. Yeah, I don't know if I have too much more to say about it. I feel like we've kind of hit on all the major points. Just, I will say for Dovlatov as a writer, I mentioned before that he really focuses on these individual character details. And I think that's one of the things I really enjoyed about reading this is also just getting the day-to-day of the camp. One very early scene, which still sticks with me, is when the guards just like walking through the camp. And he's like, kind of scared walk around at night because like the prisoners are just like hanging out. He's a little afraid, but he's like, no, I want to show I'm tough, so I'm going to walk around to show that I'm not scared of these guys that I'm extremely scared of.
Yeah.
And as he was walking around, he stops and notices this group of prisoners of Zeks who are chafir drinkers, and then he goes and talk about how they would fill a soldier's mug with water and tea, loose tea, and then they lower a razor blade attached to a long steel wire into the cup, then throw that onto a high voltage wire to boil it within seconds, and which event ends up having an effect like alcohol, and people start to act a little intoxicated after drinking it. Just details like that of just what do people do for fun? Drink no alcohol or small amounts of alcohol. We're going to find something new. We're going to be really inventive here because we got no other options. And just that granularity of how they make this tea, of how this character who is a gay man is treated, of how this office worker who works around these prisoners and almost sees herself as one of them in a weird way, right? Taking on their, dressing nicer than them, obviously, but hanging out with them, talking to them, taking on their slang. These small granularities, these peculiar features that are obviously come from someone who was there. Just to have this great sense of creating this world beyond just the ideological implications. Just his extremely good or interesting portrayal of peculiar individuals.
I think kind of what you're getting at in a lot of ways is that it's almost rehumanizing the individuals that were in the camps. And the sort of absurdity of it all, I think, in a lot of ways helps do that. It sort of doesn't just allow you to read them as a character in a novel, but it sort of probes you to think a little bit deeper about like what it means to exist in that environment.
Yeah.
And it kind of further defamiliarizes that experience, because you're not just here reading about like horror after horror and the way people were, beaten down and starved and, all of these horrible things, which of course did happen, but it's sort of it's almost like a different level of horror, this like absurd horror of like banal existence, which is, also terrible. Just
trying to figure out how to make it by. But I think you're correct that this humanization of two of these characters who are, right, there's not simply petty criminals. They're their own people, but for better or for worse, right? Some of them are better, some of them are worse. Gurin is extremely funny. The narrator seems to get along well. They chat. He tells funny stories. The narrator goes out of his way to kind of be, like I said, lets him go out in the woods by himself to use the restroom, gives him some food, whatever. Yeah, I think you characterized that correctly.
Well, I don't remember if you actually said this, but this conversation with Gurin where he's talking, and he's saying that the reason that he keeps getting chosen for these theater productions are because somebody, the interrogator as a joke wrote down that he was an actor when they sent him away, and that stayed on his record permanently. And he says, well, it's not that hard. I guess I'll do it. It beats working. And so he gets carted around to be like an actor in these little productions. And he's like, well, yeah, why not? It's better than, it's better than hauling logs. So I guess I'll do that.
Right. Yeah, maybe there's something to be said about having your entire existence dictated by an administrative mistake.
Yeah, I mean, hey, sounds like higher education to me, baby. Yeah.
Can I get you a shirt or a mug that says my existence was an administrative mistake?
Yeah, well, not at this level, but yeah.
Right.
There is also this really great line, I think, that illustrates this point from this article that I was talking about on these two sort of split norms. And it's between the political instructor and Tsurikov, one of the actors in the play. And the political instructor is just he's going on and on and on about Stanislavski and transforming, and he's giving this like theatrical acting theory, which of course, right, these people are they're just looking for some time off from work. They don't want to do hard labor, so they're willing to participate in this play. Right. But he keeps going on and on and on about Stanislavski because he thinks that he really believes in the idea that it's going to transform them into better communists or something. And he doesn't find their acting believable because they're not actors and they don't really want to be there. So he says, what Stanislavski would say if he saw, this sort of performance? He would say, I don't believe it. If an actor read a line in a phony way, Stanislavski would stop the rehearsal and say, I don't believe it. Like the cops, Surikov said? What? The primary or the political instructor didn't understand. The cops, I said, give you the same line. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. They nabbed me once in Rostov and the investigator was a real pig. And it's sort of like you can see like a lot of the humor is from this like breakdown in communication between the two, where they're like, they're working on something, but they're talking on just completely different levels. And right. That was another moment that I really loved from this.
Yeah, I think it's also kind of relatedly, I think that is a very that is both a funny section, also a good illustration of your point. Relatedly, the narrator's position too, as a mere observer, is fascinating because like he's the assistant director. Does he do anything? No, he just stands there and watches. It's just like Gurin. He's like, that's better than freezing out in the taiga while I watch Prisoners. So sure. Yeah. But the narrator himself is also not a communist. Or at least when I say that, I mean he's not a member of the party. The the political instructor is like, oh, it would be good for you to be the assistant director. You need to raise your political consciousness. And the guy goes, but I'm not a member of the party. Why should I give a shit? And the guy's like, well, that's exactly why. And then he's like, well, again, better than being out in the taiga, so sure. You've got, a character who's not a communist talking to another character who's not a communist, trying to raise class consciousness among a crowd of people who are also not communists.
Right. It's a good situation, right?
Right.
I think, and not to drag us back too far, but this idea of Stanislavski is particularly interesting. And of course, he's just chosen because he's well-known, his method is well-known, used in the early Soviet Union extensively. And what I found interesting, though, is that the basis of his method really involves being able to step into, another character, another persona, and really understand, the psychological implications of, being someone else, essentially, to the point that you understand how they would be reacting to, the smallest daily, minutia, basically. And it's just, so funny that that's what the political instructor wants, yet nobody in the story can see from anyone else's point of view.
Right.
Of course, the prisoners in the camp, they can see through the falseness, right, of this ideological veneer, right? But the political instructor who so loves his Stanislavski, right, he doesn't see the absurdity of what he himself is perpetrating, what he's continuing to do.
Right.
So that's I thought it was an interesting choice. It probably doesn't mean that much, but I thought it was interesting.
No, I think it is. I mean, considering that Dovlatov was raised in a theater family, yeah. I can't help but feel that was absolutely not an accidental choice.
Perhaps I have the key to understanding.
Perhaps only you can lead us to true understanding here. Yeah, I think that's all I had to say. Just fascinating reading. I do want to read the rest of The Zone. I'm really quite curious, especially in comparison to Shalamov's work. As someone who's as on a personal level, persistently felt like I've lived in an era after what? I don't know, but in the era of just we're here now. It's a strangely, obviously, extremely, extremely different environments, but a basic perspective which I find appealingly interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Not quite as absurd as some late right before the fall of Soviet Union, where you start getting to Moscow Patushki or Life with an Idiot levels of absurdity. Not quite that far, but just aware of the contradictions of the time and failed promises of the time you live in. It's a compelling perspective.
Yeah, I wanted to read more. I mean, we both wanted to read more late Soviet literature because we haven't really done a lot on the podcast. A part of it just being it's harder to tell what to read, and there's not as much written about it. A lot of it is still written in Russian, and so that's fine for some stuff, but it's also, we like to cover things that are written in English so that if people listening want to go ahead and find them and read them, they can.
Right.
People want us to cover more some more niche things, but it's kind of always a balancing act.
Yes. So, and this one may or may not be niche, but we think it is, but I don't know. New Yorkers, maybe we've had a different perspective on Dovlatov.
Yeah. It's not just the story itself, but the things written about the story. There's definitely plenty in English, but there's also a lot more in Russian.
Yeah, right.
Which is how it tends to go for more recent literature.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, but this is the sort of stuff we'd love to keep covering. All right, Matt, before we completely wrap up, I got to ask, speaking of late Soviet literature, what are we tackling next week?
Next week, we're going to be going back in time. We're going to be tackling Tolstoy's The Kreutzer Sonata.
The Kreutzer Sonata famously was Dr. Caitlin Shirley's favorite novel.
Yeah. But we got another doctor joining this week. We're joined by Professor Tatiana Gershkovich, who is an expert on Tolstoy's sort of late Ideology. It's super interesting. We've already recorded it. We're going to be talking about suspicious reading, a little bit about Nabokov, and extremely uncomfortable train rides. If you are planning on reading along with us, be sure to pick up your copy through our affiliate links on our website.
Yeah, like Matt mentioned, we've already recorded this, and for some of you who are familiar with the Kreutzer Sonata, you might be a little bit like, why are we talking about it? But Dr. Grushkovich has really brought me around on the Kreutzer Sonata. Before I was very much in that stance, but now I think obviously not reading it as a straightforward piece, but very interesting to talk about and consider. And I came away with some new perspectives and thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. So I am extremely excited for all of you to listen to our chat with her.
To help keep our show independent and for exclusive access to notes containing all the research that went into this episode, head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. Before we let you go, we want to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current supporters whose names will be said here.
Yes, and that's Mai, Daniel, Lou, Gary, Janice, Anne, Isaac, Emily, Caitlin, Yitza, Irini, and Pack Rob.
The music used in this episode was Starai Aquino by Peremotka. You can find more of the stuff on Bandcamp or Spotify. The links and spelling are in the show notes.
You'll hear from us again soon.